It was an ordinary autumn evening when the local football team gathered for their usual practice. The field, a patch of grass tucked away on the outskirts of town, had always been the team's second home. But tonight, something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the wind whispered through the trees, as if warning them. James, the team's captain, noticed it first. A lone figure stood at the edge of the field, watching them intently. His appearance was odd, dressed in an old-fashioned football uniform, his face obscured by a dark helmet. At first, James thought it was just another player from the nearby school who had come to watch. "Hey, are you lost?" James called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly began to move towards the center of the field, its steps unnervingly silent. The rest of the team watched, confused and uneasy. As the figure reached the middle of the field, it suddenly stopped and turned to face them. The team's coach, Mr. Miller, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice firm but with a hint of concern. The figure didn't speak, it simply raised its arm and pointed toward the goalpost. "Well, if you're here to join us, take your place," the coach said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The figure nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the invitation. James hesitated but decided to play along, calling his teammates to start the practice game. The mysterious player took its place, and the game began. But as the match wore on, something strange happened. The figure was playing as if it had been part of the team for years, its movements were smooth, almost supernatural. James couldn't keep up with it, and neither could anyone else. Suddenly, the ball flew toward the figure, but when it kicked it, the ball seemed to vanish into thin air. In its place was a sudden, bone-chilling wind that swept across the field, knocking everyone off their feet. The figure stood in the middle of the field, unmoving, as a voice echoed through the air. "You should have left me alone." Asterisk. The next day, the team was in shock when they discovered that the mysterious player was, in fact, a young man named Ethan, who had died in a tragic accident on that very field several years ago. His ghost had returned to finish a game he had never completed in life. From that day forward, the team never dared to practice on that field again. The legend of the phantom player lived on, and it was said that on certain nights, if you listened carefully, you could still hear the ghostly sounds of a football game. It was a chilly Friday night when Marcus, a talented young football player, found himself alone on the field, practicing late into the evening. The rest of the team had left, but Marcus preferred the solitude, a chance to refine his skills without distractions. As he kicked the ball against the goalpost, he noticed something strange: the ball didn't bounce back. Curious, he walked over to retrieve it. But when he reached the post, he couldn't find it. Confused, Marcus glanced around, his heart beginning to race. He called out, but no one answered. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Spinning around, he saw no one. Yet, the footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. Marcus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He quickly turned and ran back to the center of the field, his footsteps echoing in the empty stadium. When he reached the middle, he froze. The ball had returned, but it was not where it had been before. Instead, it lay on the ground, covered in a thick layer of frost, as if someone had left it there intentionally. Marcus felt a strange urge to pick it up, but as his hand reached for it, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A faint outline of a person was standing just beyond the goalpost, watching him. "Who's there?" Marcus shouted, his voice shaky. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silently staring, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Marcus, terrified, grabbed the ball and sprinted for the gate. But as he ran, the figure began to follow him, moving faster and faster. Marcus could hear the heavy breathing of something behind him. When he reached the gate, he turned one last time to look, but the figure had disappeared. The next morning, the groundskeeper found the ball in the center of the field, still frozen and undisturbed. No one could explain the strange occurrence, but Marcus never played on that field again. It was said that the ghost of a player who had died on that field many years ago was still trying to finish a game that was interrupted by his death. The town of Oakdale had always been proud of its football team, and the football field was considered a sacred place. But when Johnny, a young player, was chosen to join the varsity team, he was told to stay away from the field at night. There was something Johnny didn't know, something about the history of the field that no one ever spoke of. Johnny was a rising star, eager to prove himself and make his mark. One evening, after practice, he stayed behind to work on his skills. The other players had left, and the sky was turning dark. Johnny practiced alone, determined to become the best. As he was running drills, he felt an eerie presence on the field. He glanced around but saw nothing unusual. He continued, but the feeling didn't go away. The air grew colder, and the wind howled in the distance. Suddenly, the lights on the field flickered, and then went out entirely, plunging the area into darkness. Johnny's heart raced, but he kept his cool. He pulled out his phone to use the flashlight, but the screen flickered as well. That's when he heard the sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, behind him. Johnny turned around but saw no one. His phone's flashlight illuminated the field, revealing a figure standing near the end zone. The figure wore an old football uniform, faded and torn, and its eyes were dark, hollow pits. "Who are you?" Johnny asked, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but its head tilted, as if studying Johnny. In that moment, Johnny understood. This was the spirit of a former player who had died on that field years ago. The figure raised its hand and pointed toward the end zone, as if challenging Johnny to finish the game. Despite his fear, Johnny took the ball and ran toward the goal. But when he reached it, the figure was suddenly there, standing right in front of him, blocking his path. With a loud scream, the figure lunged at Johnny. The air was thick with cold, and Johnny felt as though he was being pulled into the ground itself. But then, just as suddenly, the figure vanished, and the lights flickered back on. Johnny ran off the field, his heart pounding. The next day, he found out that the player had been tragically injured during a game years ago, and his spirit never left the field. From that day forward, Johnny never stayed on the field after dark. The spirit of the forgotten player was still out there, waiting for the next person brave enough to challenge him. These true stories remind us that some fields aren't just places for sport. They hold memories of those who came before us, some tragic, some unfinished. If you ever find yourself alone on a dark football field, you might want to reconsider. You never know who, or what, might be watching from the shadows, waiting for their game to continue. And always remember, some legends are better left unchallenged.